Section 134 of 15,000 Useful Phrases by Grenville Kleiser. Read for LibriVox.org by Joe Brenneman. But it is a fact. But it is impossible for one. But it is necessary to explain. But it is no use protesting. But it is not fair to assert. But it is not my intention. But it is not necessary to suppose. But it is not possible to believe. But it is not really so. But it is otherwise with. But it is sometimes said. But it may be doubted whether. But it may happen that I forgot. But it will be a misfortune. But it will naturally be asked. But it will perhaps be argued. But it would be vain to attempt. But let me ask you to glance. But let me before closing refer. But let none of you think. But let us also keep ever in mind. But let us look a little further. But lo, all of a sudden. But mark this. But more than all things else. But my allotted time is running away. But my answer to this objection. But, my friends, pause for a moment. But never was a grosser wrong. But not for one moment. But notwithstanding all this. But now look at the effect. But now take notice of. But on the other hand. But on what ground are we? But passing these by. But perhaps I ought to speak distinctly. But perhaps you are not yet weary. By putting these questions aside. But quite contrary to this you will find. But recollect, I pray you, how. But, sir, it is manifest. But some other things are to be noted. But some will ask me. But sooner or later. But still, I repeat. But suppose the fact. But surely you cannot say. But that I may not divert you from. But that is not all. But that must always be the impression. But the fact is. But the final value. But the greatest proof of all. But the most formidable problem. But the necessity of the case. But the question may arise. But then, let us ask ourselves. But there is another duty imposed. But there is much more than this. But this I do not hesitate to say. But this I fearlessly affirm. But this I know. But this is a circuitous argument. But this is no place for controversy. But this is not all. But this is what I mean. But this much I affirm is true. But this warns me. But this we may put aside. But to go still further. But to say the truth. But we are met with the assertion. But we are to recollect. But we ask, perhaps. But we may depend upon it. But we think it is not wise. But we want something more for explanation. But what a blunder would be yours. But what is the fact? But what we must needs guard against. But when it is declared. But when we look a little deeper. But while it may be admitted. But who is not seen? But why do I enumerate these details? But with these exceptions. But yet nothing can be more splendid. But you should know. By no means. By the way, I have not mentioned. By this time it will be suspected. End of section 134. This recording is in the public domain.